The summer of 1989 was supposed to be magical for Sarah Mitchell. She had just graduated from Ohio State University with a degree in journalism, and in 3 weeks, she would walk down the aisle to May. Their love story was the kind that made other couples jealous. They had met during freshman orientation, been inseparable ever since, and everyone who knew them said they were destined for forever. David was everything Sarah had dreamed of in a husband. At 22, he was tall and athletic, with kind brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and an easy laugh that could fill any room. He worked as a junior accountant at a prestigious firm in Columbus, and they had already put a down payment on a small house in the suburbs where they planned to start their family. Sarah's engagement ring, a modest but beautiful solitaire, caught the light as she nervously twisted it around her finger while getting ready for what should have been one of the happiest nights leading up to their wedding. The bachelor party had been planned by David's best friend and best man, Mike Rodriguez. Mike was known for being the life of the party during their college years, but he had assured both David and Sarah that this would be a tame affair. Just dinner at their favorite steakhouse downtown, followed by some drinks and maybe a game of pool at O'Malley's pub. Sarah trusted Mike, despite his reputation for mischief, because she knew how much David meant to him, and how seriously he took his role as best man. That Friday evening, July 14, 1989, Sarah kissed David goodbye at the door of her apartment. He was wearing his favorite blue button-down shirt and jeans, looking handsome and excited about the evening ahead. "Don't have too much fun without me," she teased, straightening his collar with the familiarity of someone who had done it 100 times before. David pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her vanilla perfume that he loved so much. "Impossible," he whispered against her ear, making her giggle. "Besides, this is just Mike's way of saying goodbye to our bachelor days. Tomorrow night I'm all yours for movie night, just like we planned." They had a tradition of Saturday movie nights, complete with homemade popcorn and Sarah's famous chocolate chip cookies. It was one of the simple pleasures that made their relationship so solid. As David walked toward Mike's car waiting in the driveway, he turned back one more time to wave at Sarah, who was standing in the doorway watching him leave. The image of her silhouetted against the warm glow of her apartment light would haunt her for years to come. The last time she would ever see the man she planned to spend her life with. David climbed into the passenger seat of Mike's red Camaro, and they drove off into the Columbus night, disappearing around the corner toward downtown. Sarah went back inside, planning to spend the evening with her maid of honor Jessica, addressing wedding invitations and finalizing last-minute details. They had champagne chilling and a romantic comedy queued up on the VCR for after they finished their work. Sarah was in such a good mood that she even called her mother to chat about the final head count for the reception, and whether they needed to order more flowers for the church. Everything in her life felt perfectly aligned, like all the pieces of a puzzle coming together to create the beautiful picture she had always envisioned for her future. The first signs of trouble. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of bright sunshine that made everything seem possible. Sarah woke up around 9 o'clock, already thinking about her lazy day ahead with David. They had planned to sleep in, make pancakes together, and then spend the afternoon looking through wedding gifts that had started arriving from out-of-town relatives. She stretched contentedly in bed, reaching for her phone to call David and wake him up with sweet good-morning whispers. The phone rang and rang, eventually going to the answering machine. Sarah wasn't immediately concerned. David was notorious for being a heavy sleeper, especially after a night out with the guys. She figured he was probably nursing a mild hangover and would call her back within the hour. She decided to shower and start making breakfast, confident that by the time she was done, David would be knocking on her door with flowers and an apology for oversleeping. But as the morning stretched into afternoon, Sarah's initial amusement turned to worry. She had called David's apartment 6 more times, each call going straight to the machine. She tried his work phone, knowing it was a long shot on a Saturday, but hoping he might have stopped by the office for some reason. Nothing. Growing increasingly anxious, she decided to call Mike Rodriguez to see if he knew where David might be. Mike's phone also went to voicemail, which struck Sarah as odd since Mike was usually an early riser who prided himself on never missing calls. She left increasingly urgent messages on both men's machines, asking them to call her back immediately. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Sarah's worry had transformed into something approaching panic. She called Jessica, who came over immediately to help figure out what was going on. Maybe they decided to extend the bachelor party into a weekend trip, Jessica suggested reasonably, though even she looked concerned as she helped Sarah pace around the small living room. You know how Mike can be spontaneous. They probably drove down to Cincinnati or up to Cleveland for the day and forgot to mention it. But even as Jessica offered these explanations, Sarah could see the doubt in her best friend's eyes. Sarah decided to drive to David's apartment complex, using her spare key to let herself in. What she found there made her blood run cold. David's bed was still made, exactly as he had left it Friday morning. His toothbrush was dry, his coffee maker was clean, and there was no evidence that he had come home at all after the bachelor party. His car, a reliable Honda Civic, was nowhere to be found in the parking lot. Sarah searched through his apartment frantically, looking for any clue about where he might have gone. In David's bedroom, she found his wallet sitting on the dresser, something that made no sense if he had gone somewhere voluntarily. David never went anywhere without his wallet. It was one of his quirks that he always patted his back pocket to make sure it was there before leaving any location. Inside the wallet, she found his driver's license, credit cards, and the $60 in cash he had withdrawn Friday afternoon for the bachelor party. Why would David leave his wallet behind but take his car? As evening approached, Sarah made the decision that would mark the beginning of her 16-year nightmare. She called the Columbus Police Department to report David Thompson as a missing person. The desk sergeant who took her call was polite, but not particularly concerned. Young men disappeared after bachelor parties all the time, he explained, usually turning up sheepish and hungover within a day or two. He took down David's information and promised to file a report, but Sarah could tell he wasn't taking the situation seriously. That night, Sarah didn't sleep at all. She sat by her phone, jumping at every sound, hoping against hope that David would call with some reasonable explanation for where he had been. She imagined him walking through her door with that apologetic smile, ready to explain that his car had broken down in some remote area with no phone service, or that Mike had surprised him with an impromptu camping trip, and they had been out of touch. But as dawn broke on Sunday morning with still no word from David, Sarah began to understand that something terrible had happened to the man she loved. The investigation begins. By Monday morning, Sarah's missing person report had been assigned to Detective Ray Castellanos, a 15-year veteran of the Columbus Police Department who specialized in missing persons cases. Detective Castellanos was a patient, methodical man in his early 40s, with graying hair and the kind of steady demeanor that made people trust him instinctively. He had seen enough cases like this to know that most missing adults turned up within 72 hours, but something about Sarah Mitchell's obvious distress and the circumstances of David Thompson's disappearance made him take the case more seriously than usual. Sarah met Detective Castellanos at the police station Monday afternoon, bringing with her a recent photograph of David and a detailed timeline of everything she knew about Friday night. She had barely slept in 3 days, and her hands shook as she handed over David's picture. A candid shot from their engagement party showing David's bright smile and kind eyes. Detective Castellanos studied the photo carefully, then looked up at Sarah with the kind of gentle attention that made her feel like someone was finally taking her seriously. "Tell me everything about Friday night," Detective Castellanos said, pulling out a yellow legal pad and settling back in his chair. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave out any detail, no matter how small it might seem." Sarah took a deep breath and recounted everything she could remember. David's excitement about the bachelor party, his casual clothes, the time he left her apartment, and most importantly the fact that his wallet had been left behind in his bedroom. The detective's eyebrows raised slightly when Sarah mentioned the wallet. "That's unusual," he admitted, making a note on his pad. "Most people who leave voluntarily take their identification and money with them. Let's talk about his best man, Mike Rodriguez. When was the last time you spoke with him?" Sarah explained that she had been trying to reach Mike all weekend without success, and that his phone just went straight to voicemail every time she called. Detective Castellanos immediately tried calling Mike Rodriguez from his office phone, and like Sarah, got only the answering machine. This was the first red flag that made the detective's instincts prickle with concern. In his experience, when someone's best friend went missing, the last person to see them was usually eager to help with the investigation. The fact that Mike Rodriguez was also unreachable was troubling, and suggested that whatever had happened Friday night might have involved more than just David. The detective's next step was to visit O'Malley's pub, where the bachelor party was supposed to have taken place according to Sarah's information. O'Malley's was a popular hangout for young professionals in downtown Columbus, known for its decent food, cheap drinks, and friendly atmosphere. Detective Castellanos spoke with the evening manager, Tom Kelly, who had been working Friday night, and remembered seeing a group of young men matching the description of David's party. "Yeah, I remember them," Tom Kelly told the detective, wiping down glasses behind the bar as they talked. "4 or 5 guys, looked like they were celebrating something. They had dinner in the back booth, seemed to be having a good time. But here's the weird thing. They left earlier than usual for a bachelor party. Most groups like that stay until closing, but these guys were gone by 10 o'clock, maybe 10:30 at the latest." This information was crucial because it meant David had vanished sometime between leaving O'Malley's and the early morning hours when he should have returned home. Detective Castellanos asked Tom Kelly if he remembered anything unusual about the group's behavior, or if they had mentioned where they might be going next. The manager thought for a moment, then shook his head. "They seemed normal, maybe a little quieter than most bachelor parties. The groom looked nervous, but that's pretty typical. The best man was doing most of the talking, trying to keep everyone's spirits up. They paid their tab in cash and left like any other customers." This account matched what Sarah had told him about the evening being planned as a low-key celebration. The detective's investigation took a more serious turn when he tried to locate the other members of the bachelor party. According to Sarah, the group was supposed to include Mike Rodriguez, David's 2 brothers from Cleveland, and a college friend named Steve Morrison. But when Detective Castellanos contacted David's family, he learned that neither of David's brothers had come to Columbus that weekend. The brothers claimed they had never been invited to any bachelor party and were shocked to hear that David was missing. This revelation meant that either Sarah had been misinformed about who was attending the bachelor party, or someone had deliberately misled her about the evening's plans. Detective Castellanos felt the familiar chill that came with realizing a missing person case was about to become much more complicated. If Mike Rodriguez had lied about the guest list for the bachelor party, what else might he have been hiding about that night? Unraveling deceptions. The discovery that David's brothers had never been invited to the bachelor party sent Detective Castellanos down a new path of investigation that would reveal layers of deception Sarah never could have imagined. When he finally managed to track down Steve Morrison, David's college friend who was supposedly part of the bachelor party group, Steve's response was even more shocking than the brothers had been. "I moved to Seattle 3 months ago for a new job," Steve told the detective over the phone, his voice filled with confusion and concern. "I sent David and Sarah a change of address card and explained that I wouldn't be able to make it to the wedding. I haven't talked to David since May, and I definitely wasn't in Columbus last Friday." Steve's words hit Detective Castellanos like a physical blow, because they meant that the bachelor party, as described by Mike Rodriguez, had been completely fabricated. Detective Castellanos immediately drove to Mike Rodriguez's apartment complex, a modest development on the south side of Columbus, where Mike had lived since graduating college. Mike's neighbors hadn't seen him since Friday afternoon, when he had loaded several bags into his red Camaro and driven away. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment below Mike's, remembered thinking it was odd that he was taking so much luggage for what she assumed was a weekend trip. When Detective Castellanos used the apartment manager's master key to enter Mike Rodriguez's apartment, what he found there made it clear that Mike had not planned to return anytime soon. The apartment was cleaned out of personal belongings with only furniture and basic appliances remaining. Mike's clothes, photographs, important documents, and anything of value had been removed. In the bedroom closet, the detective found several empty hangers and dust outlines on shelves where belongings had once sat. The most chilling discovery came when Detective Castellanos searched through the few items Mike had left behind. In a kitchen drawer, he found a handwritten note that appeared to be a rough draft of something, with several crossed-out lines and rewrites. The note read, "David, by the time you read this, you'll understand that some debts can't be forgiven. What happened in college wasn't forgotten. You ruined my life, and now it's time for you to pay. Don't try to follow me. You won't find me, and no one will find you either." Detective Castellanos immediately called Sarah to inform her of these developments, though he was careful not to reveal the full contents of the note until he could meet with her in person. Sarah's reaction to learning that the bachelor party had been a complete fabrication was heartbreaking to witness. She sat in the detective's office, staring at the evidence spread across his desk, trying to process the fact that Mike Rodriguez, someone she had trusted completely, had apparently orchestrated David's disappearance. "I don't understand," Sarah kept repeating, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mike was David's best friend. They were roommates for 2 years in college. Mike was going to be the best man at our wedding. Why would he want to hurt David? What debt is this note talking about?" Detective Castellanos wished he had answers for her, but the note raised more questions than it resolved. The detective began investigating David and Mike's college history, looking for any incidents that might explain the cryptic reference to something that happened in college that ruined Mike's life. He contacted the dean of students at Ohio State University and requested access to any disciplinary records involving either young man. What he discovered was an incident from their junior year that had been buried in bureaucratic paperwork and nearly forgotten by everyone involved. In March of 1987, Mike Rodriguez had been accused of cheating on a crucial accounting exam that would determine whether he qualified for the university's prestigious internship program with a major firm in Chicago. The accusation had come from an anonymous tip that led to an investigation by the Academic Integrity Committee. Mike had vehemently denied cheating, but the evidence against him was compelling enough that he was found guilty and expelled from the internship program. The anonymous tipster, Detective Castellanos, learned with a growing sense of dread, had been David Thompson. This revelation provided a possible motive for Mike's actions, but it also raised disturbing questions about what might have happened to David. If Mike Rodriguez had been planning revenge for 2 years, waiting until just before David's wedding to strike, then David's disappearance was likely not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but a carefully premeditated act. Detective Castellanos realized he was no longer investigating a missing person case. He was likely dealing with a kidnapping, and possibly worse. Following cold trails. As the investigation into David Thompson's disappearance stretched into its second week, Detective Castellanos found himself facing the harsh reality that most missing person cases dealt with after the crucial first 72 hours had passed. The trail was growing cold, and despite his best efforts, Mike Rodriguez seemed to have vanished as completely as David had. The detective had issued a BOLO alert for Mike's red Camaro, contacted police departments in surrounding states, and even reached out to federal authorities. But so far, no one had reported seeing either missing man. Sarah Mitchell was struggling to maintain her sanity as the days passed without any word about David's whereabouts. She had taken a leave of absence from her new job at a local newspaper, unable to concentrate on anything except the investigation. Her small apartment had become a makeshift command center, with maps spread across her kitchen table, photographs of David and Mike pinned to the walls, and a detailed timeline of everything she knew about the case written on a large whiteboard she had purchased specifically for this purpose. The hardest part for Sarah was dealing with the questions from friends and family members who didn't understand the complexity of the situation. Many people, even those close to her, suggested that perhaps David had simply gotten cold feet about the wedding and run away with his best friend's help. These suggestions felt like knife wounds to Sarah, who knew David better than anyone and was absolutely certain that he would never abandon her without explanation, especially not just 3 weeks before their wedding. Detective Castellanos had expanded his investigation to include David's financial records, hoping to find some clue about where he might have been taken or what Mike Rodriguez's ultimate plan might have been. David's bank account showed no unusual activity after Friday afternoon, when he had withdrawn the $60 for the bachelor party. His credit cards had not been used since Thursday evening, when he had purchased gas for his Honda Civic. The car itself remained missing despite extensive searches throughout Ohio and neighboring states. One promising lead came from a gas station attendant in Toledo, Ohio, who called the police tip line claiming to have seen two men matching David and Mike's descriptions on Saturday morning. The attendant remembered them because they had seemed nervous and had paid for gas in cash, which was unusual for young men their age. However, when Detective Castellanos drove to Toledo to investigate further, the surveillance cameras from that weekend had already been recycled, and the attendant's description was too vague to be conclusive evidence. The detective also pursued the possibility that Mike Rodriguez had accomplices in whatever plan he had executed. Mike's employment records showed that he had worked as a bartender at several establishments around Columbus during college and after graduation, giving him connections throughout the city's nightlife scene. Detective Castellanos spent countless hours interviewing Mike's former co-workers and employers, looking for anyone who might have known about his plans or helped him carry them out. Most of Mike's former colleagues described him as charming and outgoing, but several mentioned that he had seemed increasingly bitter in recent months, often making disparaging comments about successful people and how they didn't deserve their good fortune. One bartender at a downtown club remembered Mike talking obsessively about someone who had stabbed him in the back during college, though Mike had never mentioned David by name in these conversations. The investigation took an international turn when Detective Castellanos learned that Mike Rodriguez had applied for and received a passport just 6 months before David's disappearance. This suggested that whatever Mike had been planning, it might have involved leaving the country entirely. The detective contacted the State Department and immigration authorities, providing them with photographs and descriptions of both missing men. But international investigations moved slowly and often hit dead ends at border crossings where documentation might be forged or incomplete. As July turned to August, and David and Sarah's wedding date came and passed in a blur of canceled reservations and returned gifts, Detective Castellanos began to face the possibility that this case might never be solved. He had pursued every lead, followed every tip, and exhausted every resource available to a small city police department. The case file had grown thick with reports, interviews, and dead-end investigations, but David Thompson and Mike Rodriguez remained as missing as they had been on that first Saturday morning when Sarah realized something was wrong. The detective met with Sarah on what should have been her wedding day, August 5, 1989, to update her on the status of the investigation. Sarah looked fragile and exhausted, wearing a simple black dress that seemed to reflect her state of mourning for the life she had lost. Detective Castellanos had to tell her the hardest truth the investigator ever has to share with a family member: that sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, people simply vanish without a trace, and the answers families desperately need may never come. Years of silence. By 1995, 6 years had passed since David Thompson's disappearance, and Sarah Mitchell had been forced to rebuild her life from the ground up. She had eventually returned to her journalism career, finding some solace in investigating other people's stories, while her own remained an unsolved mystery. She had moved from Columbus to Chicago, partly to escape the constant reminders of David, and partly to take a better job at a major metropolitan newspaper. Yet despite the passage of time and the hundreds of miles between her new life and her old one, Sarah thought about David every single day. Detective Castellanos had retired from the Columbus Police Department in 1993, but he had never forgotten the David Thompson case. It remained one of the few unsolved disappearances from his career that continued to haunt him. Even in retirement, he occasionally received calls from other law enforcement agencies asking about the case, or from private investigators hired by families of other missing persons who thought there might be connections to David's disappearance. Each call brought back the familiar frustration of having so many questions and so few answers. The missing person case had officially gone cold after the first year, when all active leads had been exhausted, and no new evidence had emerged. David's case file was stored in the basement archives of the Columbus Police Department, along with hundreds of other unsolved cases that represented lives interrupted and families left in permanent limbo. Occasionally, new detectives would review the file as part of their training or when working similar cases, but no one had discovered any overlooked clues or new avenues of investigation. Sarah had never stopped believing that David was still alive somewhere, though she couldn't explain the source of this conviction. She had consulted psychics, hired private investigators with her savings, and even traveled to different cities following up on reported sightings that invariably turned out to be false leads. Each disappointment was devastating, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to stop searching. The alternative, accepting that David was dead and she would never know what happened to him, was simply too painful to contemplate. The psychological toll of living with such uncertainty had been enormous. Sarah had undergone years of therapy to deal with what psychologists called ambiguous loss, the unique grief experienced by people whose loved ones disappear without explanation. Unlike traditional grief, which follows a predictable pattern of stages leading to acceptance, ambiguous loss creates a permanent state of emotional suspension where healing becomes almost impossible because there is no closure. In 1998, nearly a decade after David's disappearance, Sarah received a phone call that briefly reignited her hope. A woman named Maria Santos called from El Paso, Texas, claiming that she had seen a man who looked exactly like David working at a construction site near the Mexican border. Maria had seen David's photograph on a missing person website that Sarah maintained, and she was certain that the man she had seen was the same person. The man had been using a different name and spoke with what sounded like a slight accent, but Maria was convinced it was David. Sarah immediately took time off work and flew to El Paso, bringing with her several photographs of David and a list of personal details that only he would know. She spent 3 days searching construction sites throughout the area, showing David's picture to workers and supervisors. On the third day, she finally located the man Maria Santos had seen, and for a heart-stopping moment, Sarah thought her 9-year search was over. The man did indeed bear a striking resemblance to David, with similar height, build, and coloring. But when Sarah approached the man and showed him David's photograph, it became clear that this was not the man she had been searching for. The worker, whose name was Carlos Mendez, was genuinely sympathetic to Sarah's plight, but he had never seen David Thompson before. Carlos had been working construction in the El Paso area for over 5 years and had numerous witnesses who could verify his identity and employment history. Once again, Sarah found herself boarding a plane home with her heart broken and her questions unanswered. These false leads became a pattern that repeated itself every few years. Someone would spot a man who resembled David in a different city, or a private investigator would uncover what seemed like promising new evidence, and Sarah would drop everything to pursue the possibility that her long nightmare might finally be coming to an end. Each time the lead would prove to be another dead end, leaving Sarah more emotionally exhausted but still unable to give up hope. By 2000, Sarah had reluctantly begun dating again, though she found it impossible to form deep emotional connections with other men. How could she fully commit to someone new when part of her heart was still waiting for David to walk back into her life with an explanation for his 11-year absence? She went through the motions of normal relationships, but anyone who got close to her soon discovered that David Thompson was still the primary relationship in her life, even though he existed only in her memories and hopes. The advent of the internet had given Sarah new tools for her search, and she spent hours every week updating missing person websites, participating in online forums for families of disappeared persons, and researching any news stories that might be connected to David's case. She had learned to use search engines effectively, and she regularly input combinations of David's name, Mike Rodriguez's name, and various cities where they might have been spotted. The internet had made the world feel smaller, but it had also made Sarah realize how many places two men could hide if they were determined to stay hidden. A new life, an old mystery. By 2005, 16 years after David's disappearance, Sarah Mitchell had built what most people would consider a successful life. At 38, she was the senior investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune, known for her tenacious pursuit of difficult stories and her ability to uncover information that other journalists missed. She had won several awards for her reporting on corruption cases, and her colleagues respected her for her professionalism and dedication. But those closest to Sarah knew that her professional success was, in many ways, a sublimation of her personal obsession with finding answers to an unsolvable mystery. Sarah had never married, though she had had several long-term relationships that had ended when her partners realized they were competing with a ghost. She lived alone in a comfortable apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, and she had learned to find satisfaction in her work and her small circle of close friends. Yet David's photograph still sat on her nightstand, and she still found herself automatically checking missing person websites every morning with her coffee, a ritual that had become as automatic as brushing her teeth. The David Thompson case had become something of a legend among law enforcement agencies in the Midwest. It was one of those mysteries that captured the imagination of investigators because it had all the elements of a perfect crime: careful planning, no witnesses, no physical evidence, and no trace of either the victim or the perpetrator. Young detectives often studied the case file as an example of how someone could seemingly vanish from the face of the earth if they were clever and determined enough. In March of 2005, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Detective Maria Hernandez of the Columbus Police Department. Detective Hernandez had recently been assigned to review cold cases, and the David Thompson file had caught her attention because of its unusual circumstances and the quality of the original investigation conducted by Ray Castellanos. Detective Hernandez was calling to inform Sarah that the department was reopening the case as part of a new initiative to apply modern investigative techniques to unsolved disappearances from the 1980s and 1990s. "We have new resources available now that didn't exist in 1989, Detective Hernandez explained to Sarah over the phone. "DNA analysis has become much more sophisticated. We have better computer databases for tracking people across state lines, and we can use the internet to reach potential witnesses who might not have come forward 16 years ago. I can't make any promises, but I believe there might be angles of this case that haven't been fully explored." Sarah felt a familiar surge of hope mixed with the caution that came from years of disappointment. She had learned not to get too excited about new developments in David's case, because she had been through too many cycles of raised expectations, followed by crushing letdowns. Still, she agreed to travel to Columbus to meet with Detective Hernandez and review the case file with fresh eyes. Perhaps after 16 years, there might be some detail that had been overlooked, or some new technology that could provide the breakthrough she had been waiting for. When Sarah arrived in Columbus for her meeting with Detective Hernandez, she was struck by how much the city had changed since 1989. Downtown had been revitalized, new buildings had sprung up everywhere, and many of the places that had been important in the original investigation, including O'Malley's pub, had been demolished or completely renovated. The physical landscape of her memories had been erased, making David's disappearance feel even more distant and unreal. Detective Hernandez was a woman in her 30s with intelligent, dark eyes and the kind of focused energy that Sarah recognized in herself. As they sat in the same conference room where Sarah had first met Detective Castellanos 16 years earlier, Detective Hernandez spread out the complete case file and began walking through each piece of evidence systematically. Sarah found it both painful and oddly comforting to revisit these details that had consumed her life for so long. "The thing that strikes me most about this case," Detective Hernandez said, studying the photographs and reports, "is how well planned everything was. Mike Rodriguez had been thinking about this for months, maybe even years. He got a passport. He cleaned out his apartment. He fabricated the entire bachelor party story. This wasn't a crime of passion or an impulsive act of revenge. This was a carefully orchestrated plan that he had been working on for a long time." Detective Hernandez had brought in a forensic psychologist to create a profile of Mike Rodriguez based on the available evidence. The profile suggested that Mike was likely a person who harbored grudges for long periods of time, who was capable of elaborate deception, and who might have sociopathic tendencies that allowed him to maintain normal relationships while secretly planning something terrible. The psychologist believed that Mike had probably left the country and was living somewhere with extradition laws that would protect him from prosecution. The most promising new lead came from advances in computer technology that allowed investigators to cross-reference information across multiple databases more effectively than had been possible in 1989. Detective Hernandez had discovered that a man matching Mike Rodriguez's description had been arrested for a minor traffic violation in Brownsville, Texas, just 3 days after David's disappearance. The man had given a false name and had paid his fine in cash, but the physical description and the timing were too coincidental to ignore. International connections. The Brownsville lead opened up an entirely new avenue of investigation that pointed toward Mexico as Mike Rodriguez's likely destination after David's disappearance. Brownsville, Texas, sits directly on the border with Matamoros, Mexico, and crossing between the two cities had been relatively easy in 1989, before the security measures that were implemented in later years. Detective Hernandez contacted the FBI's International Crimes Division to request assistance in pursuing the Mexican connection, and she also reached out to private investigators who specialized in tracking people who had fled to Mexico to avoid prosecution in the United States. Sarah found herself cautiously optimistic about this new direction in the investigation. For 16 years, she had assumed that David and Mike were somewhere in the United States, hiding in a different city under assumed names. The possibility that they had crossed into Mexico explained why all the domestic searches had failed to turn up any trace of either man. Mexico was a vast country with limited law enforcement cooperation in missing person cases, especially for incidents that had occurred decades earlier. The FBI agent assigned to the case was Special Agent Robert Chen, who had extensive experience tracking fugitives who had fled to Mexico and Central America. Agent Chen explained to Sarah and Detective Hernandez that Mexico had become a popular destination for Americans seeking to disappear, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, when border security was less sophisticated. Many Americans lived in Mexican cities under assumed identities, often bribing local officials to obtain false documentation that allowed them to blend into expatriate communities. The problem with cases this old, Agent Chen told them during a conference call, is that memories fade, people move away or die, and records get lost or destroyed. If Rodriguez and Thompson did cross into Mexico in 1989, they've had 16 years to establish new identities and build lives that have no connection to their past. They could be anywhere from Tijuana to the Yucatan Peninsula, and they might not even be using names that are remotely similar to their original identities. Despite these challenges, Agent Chen agreed to work with Mexican authorities to investigate the possibility that Mike Rodriguez had crossed the border in July 1989. He submitted formal requests for information to police departments in border cities, asking them to search their records for any reports of American fugitives or suspicious activity during the relevant time period. He also reached out to contacts in Mexico's federal police force, providing them with photographs and descriptions of both missing men. While waiting for responses from Mexican authorities, Detective Hernandez continued to pursue domestic leads that might provide more information about Mike Rodriguez's state of mind and planning in the months before David's disappearance. She interviewed former co-workers, neighbors, and acquaintances who hadn't been questioned during the original investigation, hoping to uncover details about Mike's behavior that might indicate where he had gone or what he had been planning. One significant breakthrough came from Mike's former landlord, who had kept storage boxes containing items that Mike had left behind when he cleaned out his apartment. The landlord had forgotten about these boxes for 16 years, but when Detective Hernandez contacted him, he agreed to let her search through them. Among Mike's abandoned belongings, she found several items that provided crucial insights into his mindset and possible destinations. The most important discovery was a collection of travel brochures and maps featuring various locations in Mexico, particularly coastal areas popular with American tourists and expatriates. Mike had collected information about Cancun, Puerto Vallarta, Mazatlan, and several smaller beach communities along both the Pacific and Caribbean coasts. He had also saved newspaper articles about Americans who had successfully started new lives in Mexico, including several stories about people who had changed their identities and integrated into local communities. Even more revealing was a journal that Mike had apparently kept during the months leading up to David's disappearance. The journal entries were sporadic and often cryptic, but they revealed a man consumed with anger and resentment toward David Thompson. Mike wrote extensively about the cheating incident from college, but his perception of events was distorted and paranoid. He believed that David had deliberately sabotaged his future out of jealousy, and that David's success in life was built on the destruction of Mike's dreams. The most chilling entries were from June 1989, just weeks before the bachelor party. Mike wrote about finalizing his project and how David would finally understand what it felt like to lose everything. He mentioned studying Spanish and research international connections. Continued. The most chilling entries were from June 1989, just weeks before the bachelor party. Mike wrote about finalizing his project and how David would finally understand what it felt like to lose everything. He mentioned studying Spanish and researching remote locations where someone could start over completely. One particularly disturbing entry read, "David thinks he's going to have his perfect wedding and perfect life. He has no idea that everything he destroyed for me is about to be visited back on him tenfold. Some debts can only be paid in full, and the interest has been compounding for 2 years." Detective Hernandez shared these journal entries with Sarah, who found them both illuminating and terrifying. The level of hatred and planning revealed in Mike's writing made it clear that David had been in serious danger from the moment he got into Mike's car that Friday night. The entries also suggested that whatever Mike had planned, it was intended to cause David maximum psychological suffering, which might mean that David had been kept alive rather than killed immediately. Agent Chen's contacts in Mexico began responding to his inquiries in late spring 2005. The most promising lead came from the Quintana Roo State Police, who reported that they had records of an American man matching Mike Rodriguez's description, who had been questioned in connection with a bar fight in Cancun in August 1989. The man had given his name as Miguel Ruiz and had claimed to be a tourist from Texas, but local police had noted that he seemed unusually nervous and had paid a substantial bribe to avoid further questioning about the incident. This lead was particularly significant because Cancun had been one of the destinations featured prominently in the travel brochures found in Mike's storage boxes. The timing also fit perfectly. If Mike had crossed the border in July 1989, he would have had time to travel south to Cancun and establish himself there by August. The fact that he had been involved in a bar fight suggested that he might have been drinking heavily, possibly dealing with stress or guilt about whatever he had done to David. Sarah made the decision to travel to Cancun herself. Despite Agent Chen's warnings about the difficulties of investigating a 16-year-old lead in a foreign country, she arranged for a leave of absence from the Tribune and contacted a private investigator in Cancun who specialized in helping Americans locate missing persons in Mexico. The investigator, Carlos Delgado, had experience working with families of disappeared persons and understood both the legal complexities and the cultural challenges of such searches. When Sarah arrived in Cancun in June 2005, she was struck by how much the city had changed since 1989. What had once been a relatively small resort destination had exploded into a massive tourist metropolis with hundreds of hotels, restaurants, and bars. The Cancun that Mike Rodriguez would have encountered in 1989 was a much smaller, more intimate place where a newcomer would have been more noticeable and memorable to longtime residents. Carlos Delgado met Sarah at the airport and immediately began managing her expectations about what they might be able to accomplish. 16 years is a very long time, he explained as they drove through the bustling hotel zone. Many of the people who were here in 1989 have moved away or died. The businesses have changed hands multiple times. Even if your friend's kidnapper was here, finding traces of him now will be like looking for a specific grain of sand on the beach. Despite these challenges, Delgado had developed a systematic approach to investigating old cases in Cancun. He had contacts throughout the city's service industry: bartenders, hotel workers, taxi drivers, and restaurant staff who had been working in Cancun for decades and might remember unusual incidents or suspicious customers from the early days. He also had relationships with retired police officers who might recall the bar fight incident from August 1989. Their first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elena Morales, who had been working as a housekeeper at one of Cancun's older hotels since the mid-1980s, remembered an American guest who had stayed at the hotel for several weeks in late summer 1989. The man had paid for his room in cash, had seemed nervous and paranoid, and had asked unusual questions about how to obtain Mexican identification documents. Elena remembered him because he had been polite but obviously troubled, and because he had left the hotel suddenly one night without checking out properly or collecting belongings from his room. Elena's description of the American guest matched Mike Rodriguez's physical appearance, and her timeline corresponded perfectly with the bar fight incident reported by the state police. Even more intriguingly, Elena remembered that the man had been accompanied by another American who seemed to be ill or injured. The second man had rarely left their hotel room, and when Elena had seen him in the hallways, he had appeared disoriented and unsteady on his feet, as if he were recovering from an injury or under the influence of medication. This information sent chills down Sarah's spine, because it suggested that David had indeed been taken to Cancun alive but in poor condition. The fact that Mike had been asking about obtaining false identification documents indicated that he had been planning to establish a permanent new identity in Mexico, possibly for both himself and David. But Elena's account of the men's sudden departure from the hotel suggested that something had gone wrong with Mike's plan. The Trail in Paradise. Elena Morales agreed to show Sarah and Carlos Delgado the hotel room where the two Americans had stayed in 1989, even though it had been renovated multiple times over the intervening years. The Hotel Paraíso Mar had been one of Cancun's first resort properties, built in the early 1980s when the Mexican government was developing the area as a tourist destination. By 2005, it was considered somewhat dated compared to the massive all-inclusive resorts that dominated the hotel zone, but it still maintained the intimate atmosphere that had made it popular with travelers seeking a more authentic Mexican experience. The room Elena showed them was on the third floor overlooking the pool area and offering a partial view of the Caribbean Sea. Elena explained that in 1989, this had been considered one of the hotel's premium accommodations, expensive enough that most tourists stayed for only a few days. The fact that Mike Rodriguez had been able to afford several weeks in such a room suggested that he had been planning this trip for a long time and had saved considerable money for his escape to Mexico. The sick man never came to the pool or the restaurant, Elena told them as they stood in the renovated room, which now bore no resemblance to how it had looked 16 years earlier. His friend would bring him food from outside, and sometimes I would see him walking very slowly in the hallway late at night, like he was having trouble with his balance. I thought maybe he had been in an accident or was recovering from surgery. He seemed like he was in pain. Sarah's heart ached as she imagined David in this room, possibly injured and certainly terrified, while Mike Rodriguez made plans for their new life in Mexico. The image of David struggling to walk in the hotel hallway was almost unbearable, but it also gave Sarah hope that he had been alive at least a month after his disappearance. If David had survived that long, there was a chance he might have found a way to escape or signal for help. Carlos Delgado's investigation into the bar fight incident yielded additional crucial information. He located Raul Santos, a retired Cancun police officer who had responded to the disturbance at a popular nightclub called El Corazon in August 1989. Officer Santos had kept detailed personal notes about his cases, even after his official reports had been filed and forgotten, because he had always dreamed of writing a book about his experiences as a policeman in a resort city. According to Officer Santos's notes, the fight at El Corazon had started when an American tourist, who gave his name as Miguel Ruiz, had become belligerent with the bartender and other customers. The American had been drinking heavily and had made aggressive comments about people who didn't deserve their good fortune. Several witnesses had reported that the man seemed to be arguing with someone who wasn't there, carrying on angry conversations with an invisible companion. He was clearly under a lot of stress about something, Officer Santos told Delgado and Sarah as they reviewed his handwritten notes in his modest home outside Cancun. Americans sometimes came to Cancun to escape problems at home, but this man was different. He seemed angry and paranoid, like he was fighting a war that only existed in his head. When we questioned him, He kept talking about justice and settling old debts. He paid a very large bribe to make the charges disappear, which suggested he had access to significant money. The most significant detail from Officer Santos's notes was his observation that Miguel Ruiz had mentioned having a business partner who was waiting for him at their hotel. When police had offered to contact this partner to arrange transportation, Miguel had become agitated and insisted that his partner was too sick to be disturbed. This corroborated Elena's account of the second American who rarely left the hotel room and appeared to be in poor health. Officer Santos also recalled that Miguel Ruiz had left Cancun very abruptly after the bar fight incident. The man had apparently paid his fines and bribes on a Tuesday evening, and by Thursday morning, both Americans had checked out of Hotel Paraíso Mar and disappeared from the city. None of the hotel staff had seen them leave, and they had abandoned personal belongings in their room, suggesting that their departure had been hasty and unplanned. This pattern of sudden departures suggested that Mike Rodriguez had been constantly moving, never staying in one place long enough to establish deep roots or attract attention from authorities. It also indicated that he might have been struggling to control David, who could have been looking for opportunities to escape or signal for help. The fact that they had left belongings behind suggested that something had forced them to leave Cancun quickly, possibly a threat of discovery or an incident that had compromised their safety. Carlos Delgado's network of contacts throughout the Yucatan Peninsula began providing additional leads that suggested Mike Rodriguez and David Thompson had continued moving south after leaving Cancun. A taxi driver in Tulum remembered transporting 2 Americans to a remote beachfront property in late August 1989, noting that one of the men had seemed reluctant to make the journey and had appeared to be under some form of duress. A store owner in the small coastal town of Akumal recalled selling supplies to an American who had been asking about boat charters to Belize or Guatemala. These leads painted a picture of Mike Rodriguez becoming increasingly desperate and paranoid as the weeks passed, possibly realizing that his plan to establish a new life in Mexico was more difficult than he had anticipated. The language barrier, cultural differences, and constant fear of discovery had apparently taken a toll on his mental state, making him erratic and unpredictable. For David, trapped in this nightmare scenario, each move to a new location must have brought both hope for rescue and terror about what Mike might do if he felt cornered. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Delgado's contacts in Belize reported that Belizean immigration records from 1989 showed 2 American men entering the country by boat from Mexico in early September. The men had given names that didn't match any official identification, but their physical descriptions were consistent with Mike Rodriguez and David Thompson. More importantly, Belizean police had a record of one of these Americans being hospitalized in Belize City with what appeared to be injuries consistent with physical assault. The final revelation: the news that David Thompson might have been hospitalized in Belize City in September 1989 represented the most significant breakthrough in the case since his original disappearance 16 years earlier. Sarah felt a mixture of hope and terror as she and Carlos Delgado made arrangements to travel from Cancun to Belize to investigate this crucial lead. The possibility that David had been injured seriously enough to require hospitalization suggested that his situation had become increasingly desperate, but it also meant that there might finally be official records and witnesses who could provide answers about what had happened during those terrible months in 1989. Belize City in 2005 was a bustling Caribbean port that retained much of its colonial British character, with wooden buildings, English-speaking residents, and a laid-back atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the tourist-focused energy of Cancun. The Karl Heusner Memorial Hospital, where the mysterious American had been treated in 1989, was a modest facility that served as the country's primary medical center. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had been a young resident physician in 1989, was now the hospital's chief of medicine and agreed to help Sarah search through old medical records for any information about American patients from that time period. The medical records from September 1989 revealed a disturbing story that finally began to answer the questions that had tormented Sarah for 16 years. An American man, estimated to be in his early 20s, had been brought to the hospital emergency room on September 8, 1989, suffering from dehydration, malnutrition, and what appeared to be the effects of prolonged psychological trauma. The patient had been semi-conscious and unable to provide coherent information about his identity or how he had sustained his injuries. The patient showed signs of having been held against his will for an extended period, Dr. Williams explained, as she reviewed the medical files with Sarah. He had rope burns on his wrists and ankles, indicating he had been restrained repeatedly. He was severely underweight, suggesting inadequate nutrition over several weeks or months. Most concerning were the psychological symptoms. He seemed to be in a state of dissociation, barely responding to questions and appearing terrified of anyone who approached him. The medical records indicated that the patient had been brought to the hospital by another American man who claimed to be his brother and gave his name as Miguel Rodriguez. This man had told hospital staff that his brother had suffered a mental breakdown while they were traveling through Central America, and he had requested immediate psychiatric evaluation. However, Miguel Rodriguez had left the hospital shortly after admitting the patient, claiming he needed to retrieve their belongings from their hotel, and he had never returned. What happened next changed everything Sarah thought she knew about David's fate. The patient, who had been listed as John Doe due to his inability to provide identification, had gradually recovered enough to communicate with hospital staff over the following week. When he finally began speaking coherently, he revealed that his name was David Thompson, that he was from Columbus, Ohio, and that he had been kidnapped by his former friend Mike Rodriguez and held captive for nearly 2 months. Dr. Williams had kept detailed notes about David's account of his ordeal, partly because his story was so extraordinary and partly because she had been concerned about the legal implications of treating a kidnapping victim in a foreign country. According to David's statement, Mike Rodriguez had drugged him on the night of the bachelor party and transported him to Mexico, where he had been held in various remote locations while Mike attempted to force him to cooperate with a plan to disappear permanently and start new lives under false identities. David had told Dr. Williams that Mike's original plan had been to force him to withdraw his life savings and use the money to establish new identities in Mexico or Central America. Mike had believed that David owed him this money as compensation for the damage done to his life by the cheating incident in college. However, David had refused to cooperate, leading to increasingly desperate and violent attempts by Mike to coerce his compliance. The psychological torture David described was horrific in its calculated cruelty. Mike had repeatedly told David that Sarah believed he had abandoned her, that his family thought he had run away from the wedding, and that no one was looking for him. Mike had forced David to write letters renouncing his engagement and explaining that he had decided to start a new life in Mexico, though these letters had apparently never been sent. The isolation and psychological manipulation had been designed to break David's will and make him accept his new circumstances. But the most shocking revelation in Dr. Williams' notes was what had happened to David after his hospitalization in Belize City. David had recovered sufficiently to provide a detailed statement about his kidnapping and had expressed desperate eagerness to contact his family and return to the United States. However, before arrangements could be made for his repatriation, David Thompson had made a decision that would extend Sarah's agony for another 16 years. On September 18, 1989, David had checked himself out of the Karl Heusner Memorial Hospital against medical advice and disappeared once again into the streets of Belize City. He had told Dr. Williams that he couldn't bear the thought of returning to Columbus and facing Sarah after everything that had happened to him. He felt too damaged and traumatized to resume his old life, and he was terrified that Mike Rodriguez might find him again if he returned to the United States. David had chosen to remain missing rather than confront the psychological aftermath of his ordeal. Dr. Williams had tried to convince David to contact his family or at least notify American authorities about his situation, but David had refused all offers of help. He had asked only for directions to areas of Belize where Americans could live anonymously, and he had walked out of the hospital wearing donated clothes with no money and no identification. Dr. Williams had filed a report with local police about the kidnapping allegations, but without David's cooperation, there was little that Belizean authorities could do to investigate or pursue the case. This revelation meant that David Thompson was potentially still alive somewhere in Central America, living under an assumed name, and deliberately avoiding contact with his former life. For Sarah, this news was simultaneously the answer to her 16-year search and the beginning of an entirely new nightmare. David was alive, but he had chosen to remain missing. He had made a conscious decision to let her believe he was dead, rather than return to face the life they had planned together. As Sarah sat in the hospital administrator's office in Belize City, holding photocopies of David's medical records and Dr. Williams' detailed notes about his recovery and disappearance, she finally understood that her search had been both successful and futile. She had found the truth about what happened to David Thompson in 1989, but the truth was more complex and painful than any of the scenarios she had imagined during her years of wondering and waiting. The story ended not with a joyful reunion or even the closure of confirmed death, but with the devastating knowledge that the man she had loved had survived his ordeal, but had chosen to remain lost rather than return to her. David Thompson had become complicit in his own disappearance, transforming from victim to willing participant in the fiction of his own death. For Sarah, this final revelation was perhaps the cruelest twist in a story that had already taken everything she had believed about love, loyalty, and the possibility of happy endings. Sarah Mitchell returned to Chicago with the medical records and witness statements that finally solved the mystery of David Thompson's disappearance, but the solution brought no peace. She knew now that David was probably still alive somewhere in Central America, living under a false name and deliberately hiding from the life they had planned together. The knowledge that he had chosen to remain missing was more painful than any of the scenarios she had imagined during her 16 years of searching. In Cancun, a waiter named Jose Martinez, who had been working at beachfront restaurants since the early 1990s, occasionally wondered about an American customer he remembered from years past. A quiet, haunted-looking man who had paid for his meals in cash and always sat alone, staring out at the Caribbean Sea as if he were searching for something he had lost forever. The man had claimed his name was Daniel Torres, but Jose had always suspected there was more to his story than he revealed. Some secrets, Jose knew, were too heavy for any one person to carry alone, but not everyone was brave enough to share their burden with the world.